All right. In Chapter 11, Part 2 of Griffin's on human rights, we're still in Chapter 11 and Part 2 of Chapter 11. Human rights discrepancies between international law and philosophy. So we're getting to this list problem that Griffin talked about earlier. You know, how do the lists that have been cooked up in international treaties and international law, how do they compare with a philosophically derived set of human rights? So how do you compare these lists? Well, remember in this, just as a quick summary of Griffin's view, from personhood, we derive sort of the general notions of these human rights. There are abstract notions, and practicalities give them shape. So that's really Griffin's sort of theory in a nutshell, right? Autonomy and liberty. Okay, so we can look a little bit more in personhood. Autonomy and liberty, welfare as well, is crucial to personhood, and these need human rights to protect them, right? No question there. So when we're talking about what are human rights in Griffin's account, we're always asking what are the things, like how are we going to protect our autonomy, our liberty, and ultimately the security in order to pursue and to follow up on in order to have autonomy, have liberty, to exercise our autonomy and liberty, what kinds of welfare conditions, like what kinds of goods do we need? So what are sort of the negative duties of people to get out of our way and the positive duty to help us out in order that we can be fully normative agents, right? Conceiving of possible lives to live and pursuing those lives. So we'll need some security, so welfare will need protection. Now, some rights, as we'll see, like a little bit on some kind of privacy, not all privacy, but some kind of privacy, may cut across all of these. But basically, the story is always protecting normativity. And so the ideas of the autonomy, the liberty, and the welfare that are involved in order to be a functioning normative agent. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all the items in the list, but generally, what Griffin is doing is he looks at these lists of these non-philosophical, that is the treaty lists, international law, and all that stuff. He looks at these lists and he says, you know, most of the human rights that are on these lists, they are defensible, right? You can make the argument on his personhood account that these are decent lists of human rights. That is, well, to be a little bit more specific, that most of the items that are listed as human rights, you could then defend on the personhood account. Yeah, that'll go through. In other words, you just look at a claim that X is a human right and you say, well, does X really, is it justified on the basis of X really protects our normativity, protects our personhood? And if it does, then you've probably got a pretty good argument, according to Griffin's view, that, yeah, that's a human right. If it doesn't, well, that's a different story. So some, he says, are debatable. Some are going to be pretty clear, and some are not acceptable. But keep in mind what we mean what Griffin is after when he says, well, that's on a human rights list, and it's not acceptable as a human right. So in other words, for example, Q could be a human right to something. It turns out that it's not justified in terms of the protection of personhood. But that doesn't mean that it follows from that just because Q doesn't protect my personhood, that doesn't mean that Q is not important at all, that it's irrelevant or it's not a right at all. It could be a right. It might not be a human right. It might be a right to something, but it might be it could be a civil right. It could be something else, right? So now, again, always keep in mind that like Griffin is stressing that there's morally significant things that are not human rights. And sometimes even the violation of a human right might not even be that big of a deal. And he gives examples where sometimes a government might violate a human right, and actually a temporary one on your personhood, but it's not that big of a deal because it only happened for a short while. Whereas something that doesn't violate a human right, might be something that you'd be much angrier about if it happened to you. So it's don't always, Griffin is trying to break this notion that the morally significant is nothing different than the domain of human rights. So there can be human rights that are violated, but it's not a huge deal. And of course, most of them, when they're violated, it is a huge deal. But just because something is not justified in terms of being a human right, it could still be morally significant. That's the key point. So unacceptable cases, they could be laudable moral aspirations and extraordinarily important. We just wouldn't classify them as a human right. So it doesn't mean that the unacceptable cases are worthless. Don't read that into. He's not saying that. Then there's the ones that are acceptable. Those are pretty straightforward. Then there's the debatable, the borderline, the ones the claims that to human rights that are in fact have a complex relationship with personhood. These are ones where it's very difficult to show that they don't protect personhood or that they really do. It's not clear how they relate to personhood. And some of them, it's going to be problematic because they might have to do with the notion, really digging into the notion of dignity. Because sometimes we can argue about, like some of these, as we saw, this list of human rights is connected and flows out of the concept of dignity. Now, if you don't really have a clear notion of what dignity is, and people do disagree on what is a violation of dignity, because we often say to each other, have some dignity, and we disagree on it. So sometimes we think certain things may violate dignity and sometimes not. In other words, it's not self-evident. We're not all walking around with automatic a priori, previously installed dignity recognizers, and that they all function in the same way. No, we often disagree on questions of dignity. Those kinds of rights that are linked to a deeper, richer, more complex, more questionable, more deeper interpretation of dignity could fall into this debatable borderline where people would say, I'm not sure that's an affront to dignity. I'm not really sure that's connected to personhood, or it might be connected to personhood in a way that I don't think is truly important in terms of dignity. Anyways, there can be arguments about that. And in this case, you're going to have to start looking at philosophy because, as we talked earlier, the drafters of these of those that were involved in the drafting of these documents, they really just said dignity of the person and they left it at that. Well, sometimes claims are going to be made that it's not sure exactly what kind of notion of dignity that you're using. Now, you could say, well, we could put parameters on the notion of dignity, but if we don't, how should it be understood? Griffin has talked about dignity being rooted in autonomy and liberty and welfare, but that's not the only way. We could, take a kind of Kantian approach and in a way talk about dignity in terms of unpack dignity of the person in terms of respect for the person, and that would mean we give, all persons around us, we give them respect. So all persons have dignity. But now consider this. You can probably see where this is going. And just think quickly. Griffin's account of the normative agent is not coextensive with the concept, right? Doesn't have the same extension as human, right? Because babies aren't normative agents, and people who have advanced cases of dementia aren't. They're morally significant, but they're not protected by human rights because they don't have this normative agency. But if respect includes all, is coextensive, that is, respect for the person is coextensive with humans, then all of moral discourse is going to be flowing out of this respect. And if you make that equivalent to human rights, well, then you're back in that problem that Griffin has complained about is, well, now you're turning everything in morality. Now it's just human rights. In other words, that human rights just replaces morality because the two are completely coextensive. And so all these kinds of things about something being morally important but not a human right, that doesn't make any sense. So when any kind of moral transgression, even a mild one, right? Remember Griffin's arguments that even a very mild moral transgression, if morality and human rights are coextensive, then someone being rude to you is, even mildly rude, could be a moral transgression and therefore a human rights violation. So nothing escapes human rights violation. No act of immorality, no matter how trivial, it's a human rights violation. So he thinks that this is going to be a big problem if we do that. And of course, again, he thinks it trivializes by making, if everything becomes a human right, then it dilutes the whole notion of a human right. So we should be very careful and make sure that we preserve the impact of the term, even, and it's kind of a rhetorical device too, that we should preserve the impact of the term human rights and not just use it everywhere. All right, so the borderline cases, he thinks are in these are not clear, whereas he's trying to provide some clarity by unpacking the source of the problem, namely, what do you mean by dignity? Well, he's going to unpack it. So, so we should start in that direction when we start doing human rights, by starting with a clear notion of dignity rooted in this notion of personhood. And then, of course, the acceptable cases, fine, they're acceptable, they're clear, there's no problem here. But it's an interesting point to notice that Griffin is stressing that you need, it's not the case that philosophy can do everything on its own, right? As much as I love philosophy, I have to admit it can't do all the work. And Griffin points this out, and this is an important point to think about. Philosophy can serve as an explanatory framework. It can also help us with justifications. It can also derive our HRs in an abstract way from personhood. And that's great. But the question that we haven't asked so far is, okay, can you derive all human rights straight from personhood? Can you do a logical analysis? In other words, can the philosopher, kind of like the mathematician, just come up with all of it in his or her, little secret room and start writing all this down and go, well, I've analyzed the concept of normative agent, and I've got this list, and my list is not only totally defensible philosophically, but it's complete. Now that's a different question, right? And Griffin says, no, it's not going to be complete. It might be accurate, defensible, and all that, but it's going to be fundamentally incomplete. In other words, kind of think about how mathematics can articulate all kinds of physical possibilities, but the physicist has to run out and see which one is there and may come up with new stuff that the mathematician really can't reach on his or her own. Same thing in philosophy. You can get a lot of HRs through this abstract analysis, but there are going to be things that really are going to come up from the concrete world. And so it's an important point, and that's why in our pursuit of human rights, as I said in a previous video, we have to think about not just the philosophical side of things, but the more concrete side, like the treaties and what people come up with that are dealing with actual, right, concrete circumstances. So the practicalities will give them their shape, but not just that. We will get also human rights will come out of practical concerns as well. And then we can examine, oh, well, does that support personhood? So he gives an example of this. For example, okay, so if you look at the UDHR, and it is our Article 15.1. All right, there we go. UDHR, Article 15.1. There is a human right, think about this, there's a human right to a nationality. You're not going to get this from an abstract philosophical analysis, because a concrete term like nationality, that's a political term. That's not going to turn up in an abstract analysis of the concept of personhood. So what's the big deal about that? Well, it's a contingent fact, right? This idea of there being nationalities, that's not a logical fact. That's just the way the world worked. And I say work because it wasn't always the case that there were nationalities. People used to organize themselves in different political structures. But it is interesting to note that as the centuries rolled along, the dominant political unit of organization on the planet is the nation state, or sometimes maybe the plurality of nations. But nonetheless within a state. So a state structure, and with which we associate like a citizenship or maybe a nationality or something. But some sign of involvement in this state structure, that's a contingent thing. It could have been, as it was in other things, different kinds of communities people belong to, like and religious communities or whatever. So it wasn't always conceived in terms of membership in a state or even a nationality. Thomas Aquinas, I'm not sure he considered himself Italian. I doubt it. But he would certainly have identified with himself as being a Christian. So anyway, but that's a contingent fact of history, right? Political organizations change. And so history can give us these contingencies, and then we have these practicalities, and then we adjust. Well, what's a good vehicle? Well, this right to a nationality is important, because think about when you lack one, right? It's often said that the person without a passport is a person without a home. Yeah, that's not good to be without a passport. It makes life rough. And when people do move and are forced to move, it's rough, right? When they don't have documents and all these kinds of things, it's not made easy. Why? Because most of the world really runs on, these kinds of notions, and especially like, what nationality are you? And what's your document to show it, and all that stuff. And so it makes it very difficult for people that lack that. And so that's really damaging. Think about it, not having that is really damaging. And so that's why people take steps to say, oh no, everyone has a right to that. You can't have it where someone is deprived of that completely. That's got to be a human right, because without that, you're kind of at the mercy of, well, nothing's there to really left to protect you. So that's a contingency that has its roots in the contemporary political organization of the world. So it's a contingency that comes out of the contemporary political organization, and the justification for the claim of the human right to nationality goes back to the philosophy. So that's how philosophy can help play a role, but it's not necessarily going to give you all the goods, but it's going to give you a means of justifying why a contingent result, nation states, membership in those, is in fact a human right. Okay, so citizenship, it can be argued, nationality, citizenship, however you want to put it, can be argued as protective of our personhood, human right. Okay, so Griffin will look at a number of cases like this, and you can go through this. Now, there's a couple of more things I want to comment on, but I'll save that for the next video.